Hi, my name is David Hanlon. I'm pleased to be able to present this talk to you today about photography and archaeology, and was happy to be asked by the St. Louis Camera Club to provide some insights about things that I had been doing in the field for a number of years. My hope is in giving this presentation of images that I could provide some ideas about how archaeologists especially use photography, as well as individuals who are interested in doing photographs that represent cultures or ethnographic ideas that can be seen and explored through photography. The presentation I'm giving you today is based on some work that I was doing over a period of 10 different summers between 1990 and 2001, when I was an archaeologist and photographer at an excavation in the areas of Syria that today we've been hearing a lot about in the news and over the last couple of years, especially areas of great degree of tragedy and loss for people that live there. The work that I wanted to show you, though, kind of entails the terrain that is encompassing the areas where people have lived for thousands of years, and where there's not only fertile farmlands and fields, but also vast deserted areas too. Usually when I was traveling with the photographers, I'd have a set of cameras with me to record both on film and as transparency material, because normally when archaeologists are using photography, they'll want to have both color and black and white formats. And before we really had some good digital cameras at our disposal, the premise of using some low resolution electronic files was not really all that feasible. So transparency material and film was still the predominant formats that we used during this period. The excavations that we were doing were involved in a site in the northeastern part of Syria called Tel Tunanir. And to get to Tel Tunanir was usually a fairly arduous full-day journey from Damascus, where we would arrive, and then we'd travel by road up through the desert to the city of Palmyra, the great Roman ruins there, and then up the Habur River to the site of Tel Tunanir. St. Louis Community College was actually given the role of doing a rescue excavation along with universities from throughout the world, because the Habur River was going to be dammed and flooded on about 60 different sites from the early Bronze Age through the medieval period. And so beginning in 1988, St. Louis Community College had a field school during the summer months to excavate this particular site, which I'll talk about. When we arrived in Damascus, though, usually one of the things I tried to do was to spend a good amount of time trying to photograph the city, especially the old city that remains from the pre-Roman period, and to look at its contemporary character, and not only in the markets where we'd meet some specific people that we knew fairly well from year after year, but also to some of the areas around the city where you get a better feeling for the entire degree of space. And some of the craftspeople that we met in the Jewish quarter and the Christian quarter of the city were, again, fairly amiable for being ready to be photographed occasionally. And I would always work fairly with a good degree of discretion and not ever really use cameras with long lenses, and would just be fairly selective as the pictures I would take. But my hope is that it would translate to some degree some of the ideas about the character of both the commercial small shops that are in the old city, but also some of the remnants from the older periods too. Things like the Umayyan Mosque were certainly a kind of centerpiece of the city, and so photographing in that area, and then on the side streets in the Christian quarter and other spots pretty much for a couple weeks every year gave me a fairly big kind of portfolio of images to consider what the character of the city looked like. Then traversing from there across the desert to our excavation site, we would pass through the city of Palmyra, which sadly has a lot of the character of the city has been destroyed by ISIS when they were living there for quite a number of months several years ago. But fortunately, having been able to visit the site over 10 different summers, I was able to collect quite a number of photographs that, again, recorded different parts of the city and the character of the architecture as well too. Once reaching the site of our excavation on the Hobart River, you can see where the little notation is where the dam had been completed. Finally, by the end of the time that we were there, the drought that's followed that particular completion of the dam, though, never really ended up affecting the site that we were working with at Tunanir, which was an ancient site that was founded in the 3rd millennium and then continued to be occupied through the Roman period, and there was Parthian occupation, and then eventually it was destroyed by Tamerlane in the 1400s when it was a prosperous community with both Christian and Arab components to it. But north of our site were some larger early Bronze Age sites of Tel Brak and Tel Mozan and others too that were excavated by UCLA and a number of other important excavation groups from throughout the world. So the terrain of this particular area, which is known as the Jazira, or island, because it was an area of land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was kind of the breadbasket from antiquity for a lot of the great civilizations. And even today, when you visit the area, it's somewhat bereft of trees, but you can really see over a big swath of terrain, especially from higher vantage points. I'm actually standing on the mound that we were excavating, and most ancient sites in this area are in fact large accumulations of debris of material that's been built up generation after generation on top of each other, and these are called mounds, much like Cahokia mounds are today in terms of scale and size, but usually a little bigger and not ceremonial, but instead just the remnants of number of building levels on top of each other that's been kind of weathered down over time, but have still been elevated above each other. And so when we excavate, usually the information on the very top of the mounds is the latest, and as you dig further down, you start to find earlier layers until you get to the very base of it. Here's the full view of the site we were excavating. You can kind of see the peak of the mound chunked out, and quite a good amount of earth had been removed for showing levels of excavation that over a number of years were digging down into the core of the mound, and eventually we got down to the pre-Roman period in that area before the dam was completed and we left after the 2001 season. From our last season, here's kind of an overview showing the excavation areas that we're working with, and you can kind of see that the mound itself has quite a number of areas where buildings and shops and hotels and things were excavated, but off to the side are additional buildings too. There was on the east side, the small church that I was kind of involved in overseeing the excavation from beginning in 1990, and then down in the left-hand lower corner is a number of buildings associated with the monastery church and associated buildings that the monks use for processing and creating wine and for storage and other things too. In excavating a site and using photography in recording the excavations, the system is usually set up where grids that are 5 by 5 meters are marked off in a north-south direction and then excavated down from those particular areas. When the square grid's been completed, then those areas that are the divisional parts that are usually called bulks are then potentially removed to show the walls or other features that are within those. But it's definitely a scientific approach where the regimen of being able to find information at certain levels and mark them in terms of where they are in the position in the square is really kind of critical, because one of the things I always tell students about the relevance of photography in science, and especially in the science of archaeology, is that once something's removed from its position, the only record of it that remains is through the measurements and drawings that you have in your notes, as well as the photographs that have been made too. So my role as a photographer was to be fairly careful about not only marking and registering the information about what each frame shows in the picture, but then also being fairly clear about showing the scale, like the little marker that's in this particular scene of a threshold of one of the church rooms is 30 centimeters long. Each of the little white and black segments is 10 centimeters each. So it's kind of an understood marker that indicates scale and size. And then the lines that you see are the division lines of where the squares were. So again, you can visualize what the notes show in terms of where information is in the specific building that you're excavating. Now, one of the really interesting things about this particular site, it was really rich in artifacts that archaeologists that work on North American sites will sometimes be thrilled if they find some pottery sherds and some flint and things like that. On this particular site, there were so many large vessels and coins and other objects coming up every day that we felt really the richness of the opportunity to assess and to draw and to photograph these particular artifacts. We couldn't bring them back to the United States, but they hopefully have been saved from destruction in the storerooms of some of the local museums, although we will never really be sure. Here's a vessel that's being uncovered. You can notice it's quite a bit below ground level because it's in a room of a building that was next to the monastery, and they were using the vessels to store wine that was created out on the site. Photographing these really large vessels proved challenging, and certainly in one of the roles that a field photographer has in doing work is that although I did bring lights for the first couple seasons, I found that the electricity at the site was so sporadic that I couldn't really be able to use them consistently. So I found ways to use natural lights at certain times of day and then use backgrounds that could negate a lot of distractions to try to get successful pictures. Sometimes you'd have to rig a camera up at a higher level, perhaps when photographing some really large subjects, and the smaller subjects, especially Roman coins, which are quite small, would have to use close-up filters or macro lenses and try to find lighting methods that would allow the relief to pop out and the surface of the materials too. But having the benefit of being able to work at the same particular area, and in the building we used as our kind of research center that we built on site over 10 summers, I was able to get a pretty good handle on how the best results from working in the field at least could be cultivated for the finished results that the archaeologists needed for the publications that they were making. One of the other things that proved challenging was getting vantage points that were high enough, this is before drone technology, that would allow you to see the entirety of a structure. So usually at the end of the season, we'd be able to hire, if we were lucky, an electrical bucket truck to have me put up into the air somewhat precariously, and it was notoriously windy at the site too, to make pictures from a slightly elevated position, because there were some parts of the site that were high enough that you could see across areas, but most of the places we were working with, you could not get elevated enough, even with the ladder, to get high enough to see a really large structure. So here's the Basilica Church that is in the southern part of our site after we finish excavating it. And so this image from an electrical bucket truck is probably the better example of gaining enough height at least to see across the nave and the apse to get a better sense of the whole structure. And then the smaller church that I was involved in, again with a ladder, you could sometimes get high enough to see where we bisected the apse to see layers of an earlier church beneath it. And we did try some kite photography too. They allowed us to use kites because they felt the kites were kids' toys, and so that if we could rig up a camera with an automatic exposure back on it so that it would fire off a frame every 30 seconds or so, we could try to fly a kite with it on it to make pictures. It was always a challenging and somewhat harrowing element, especially when several cameras were damaged when they went down precipitously under rocks, But we were able to get some occasional pictures like the one on the right that showed enough of a vantage point that you couldn't get from any other kind of level, that it was fairly helpful. Today with drones we can do this pretty easily, but in the 1990s and early 2000s it was kite photography, which some of you may remember, was a pretty interesting and somewhat less than ideal way to get aerial pictures. The church that I was involved with and even yielded quite a number of amazing artifacts, like a chalice that we found in a well outside the church. Built into some later foundations of the church were parts of a lintel that were from an earlier 7th century church that had been built upon to enhance and expand the size of the later church. And then in the monastery church, probably some of the most spectacular artifacts were these limestone blocks that featured stylized crosses and in much of early Christian or Armenian style of illustration. The area that we're working in is in an area where Armenian influence and Eastern Orthodox influence would have certainly been prevalent, and artists that were probably working in some bigger centers would have sent some of their work down to the smaller regional churches. And these date from around 1100 or so. One of the other things that you oftentimes do, aside from photography when you're working in a field setting, is to do drawings too. And I ended up doing quite a bit of the drawings of the artwork that would come out, and pottery and things like these. These are all the remnants that we found that were parts of the illustrated crosses from both the smaller church and the monastery church between the late 1980s and 2001, which is our last field season. The other thing we found at the site too, which is also interesting, was a large caravanserai or kind of hotel from the 1200s that featured a mosque that was still relatively intact. The ceiling had collapsed when the Mongols attacked the site and set it on fire, but the prayer niche and the side panels that were in the areas next to the niche still survived. And these are a couple of the pieces that were in there. That round kufic decorated piece would have been on the ceiling or high on the walls, and it was found on the floor. And there were two other ones in addition to the one that's on the left. And then the right-hand picture shows a niche, again with kufic writing on it, that was outside the main prayer niche against the wall that was facing south. Again, these are fairly large pieces, were kind of tricky to photograph with enough raking light to bring out the relief, but against kind of a neutral black velvet background. But once we kind of got the setup area that we knew had the best light ready, then the work to do the records of the pieces was fairly consistent. The team of people that we work with involved a group of Americans and local farmers who were part of the neighborhood around the excavation area, and you can kind of hardly make out the difference between some of the Americans and some of the workers that we work with every year for at least the 10 summers I was there, and then a few other summers before I arrived. And so one of the things I thought it important to be able to do too, in addition to the archaeological work, which certainly took up most of the day, was to try to represent something about the culture in this area too, because it was a really unique opportunity to get to know people that had lives that were entirely different than mine, but also had a tradition and a character of their families that most Westerners didn't know about. So this is a really great opportunity to try to find out more about the character of their life in this area next to the river. So this last part is telling you a little bit about some of the portraits I did to kind of represent the characteristics of life in the Syrian Jazeera for individuals in the later 1990s. Again, kind of right before technology, cell phones, other kinds of things that are kind of characteristic of everybody's life came into play, and certainly before the destruction of the war, where most of these people were displaced or sent away to some other area. Werda was the daughter of one of the chief individuals that lived in the area across the street from our excavation, and so she was around a lot from the period that when I began to work at the site until the very end. And so because she was part of a family that we worked with a lot, I was able to photograph her pretty often along with her brothers. And it was interesting to have such a long-term project in play where you could follow people through the years and see at the end of the project how things had changed from them from where they were at the beginning of the project too. Most of the individuals that we worked with when they weren't with us on the site were herding sheep or irrigating farmland. And one of the things that I tried to do when I returned back home every year was to look at the pictures that I made to see if there were gaps where I wasn't able to show certain things that I wanted to be able to show about the lives of people that you really didn't know about. And so after the first couple of seasons, I realized I had a decent amount of portraits, but I didn't really have anything that showed the way in which they worked the land. And so they knew me well enough where they didn't pay that much attention to where I was when I was photographing, but still had to be kind of careful about not getting in their way and being close enough, though, at the same point to get a feeling for the immediacy of what they're doing. And so, harvesting chaff and burning off fields and things like that was part of a seasonal activity. And so I thought it was important to try to incorporate that into the pictures I was able to make and bring back too. And the same is true with domestic life, about cooking bread on a heated piece of metal or preparing animals for a feast for special occasions and things we were given kind of access to, which again, as an outsider, you weren't normally able to show, or bringing water back to the house from the river. Seems like fairly mundane activities to them, but for telling a story about a culture, sometimes the mundane or everyday activities are important to capture and hold to see how it fits into the whole set in terms of providing an idea about what's happening in people's lives. The building in the background in this picture, by the way, is the dig house that we lived in and had our labs and storage areas for artifacts. Sometimes when we needed to have some additional structures built for storing wheelbarrows and shovels and things like that, they would make mud bricks, and here's a set of them drying in the sun, which is again a traditional form of building material that the houses of the families that we worked with were largely made of. And it was the kind of the regional historic method for making images, of making building materials. So this image I thought was important to include in the set too, because it gives you a feeling for the day-to-day foundation for the way in which people's lives are kind of established and worked with. And then certainly in portraiture, one of the things I found that was especially helpful and interesting in this work was that everyone was really friendly and apt to be photographed without a lot of reservations. And in the Arab world, you can get a lot closer sometimes to people without them feeling you're invading their space than you can in the West. And when I was doing portraits, I certainly wanted to be able to try to show the strength of individuals and the expressions that they give you that kind of give you an insight about them as people, but also the closeness and the ties that they have as family units too. And I felt really fortunate to be, I guess, accepted enough as someone that they knew pretty well that I could photograph women in this area too, which again, as you were just passing through, you would normally not be able to photograph the women of family members that you didn't really know very well. But the kind of relaxed and friendly poses that they would allow me to record really gave kind of a truer sense about the everyday life as an insider would see them. And so that was one of the real benefits of being able to consistently work at this particular site year after year, that I would be able to kind of fade into the background to do photographs and snip away at it a little bit at a time, not being too overly anxious about making too many, but making specifically ones that I would want to try to show something about the family or the culture. Sometimes they would ask me for a photograph. You can kind of see in the background pictures that I would have brought back or that others would have brought back that they would save and post around their house. And some individuals like Shimsa Hamid, who was one of the kind of the key women of the village, I'd want to be able to show as an important person in this kind of set of people that would be illustrated from the families that we work with a lot. And also pictures like this to show how connected fathers were to the children as well too, which again in the West you don't really hear a lot about in terms of Arab men and their roles as not being perhaps as connected to children as you would think they actually are. So an image like this, even though it's not as interesting a picture, I thought was still an important one to include in the set of images that ended up being some of the better ones from the years I was working in Syria. The dig house that we had a kind of a little seating area where a lot of pictures were able to be made fairly effectively, or since the buildings that they lived in were really similar, I would oftentimes photograph in their village or neighborhood too. Sometimes avoiding some dramatic lighting could be especially beneficial in photographing, like in the prior picture, a mother and son, or in this case a young couple, or a mother with their children. Hadir was certainly one of the more insightful and professional of the people that we work with every year, and he would be always the kind of the person that would be able to assess the character of what was happening in a square perhaps better than others, and would be an important kind of person to rely on to keep people that were, the local family members informed about what we're doing, and also kind of ready to do the best work that they could in terms of assessing what was happening in the square and working with us to make sure that when things were found that they were properly measured and photographed. And Ahmed Diab was one of the leaders of the family that lived just adjacent to the excavation site. So the Diab family and the Hamid family living across the street were especially two of the primary families that we work with a lot, and ended up photographing their activities in the off hours as well too. Photographing in people's homes sometimes allowed some tricky lighting circumstances, and at the same time sometimes some beneficial situations where you're able to photograph things that are more spontaneous. In this case I liked the way the backlighting on the smoke looked like Arabic writing. And occasionally this is Hamid, who is the patriarch of his family, was able to use the lighting from doorways or windows to make an image, even though sometimes in the summertime it was really hot in these buildings and not necessarily the easiest places to maneuver to try to get a good position for a picture, especially when you get invited to what seemed to be kind of strange events to be invited to, like a circumcision, and make photographs that showed more about what was happening at the moment rather than the specific event. Here is where the entire family and Hamid's standing over it, and the child that's being circumcised is kind of providing you a feeling for how important an event was for the family. This image shows a child in swaddling clothes. Have you ever heard that expression and wondered what it was? This kind of really tight wrapping that goes around children is a typical way in which children are kept kind of tightly bundled and content, oftentimes in family settings. And so this picture that shows Ilea, who is the mother of this child, in this kind of active home environment with the swaddling clothes apparent too. Children were especially interesting to photograph because even though they were really young, they had this kind of sense of poise and sense of awareness of themselves that was really interesting, given the fact that they had never been photographed by people before. We had Polaroid cameras that we'd bring and be able to give pictures to the children and to their older siblings right away, but usually then I'd have to make prints and bring them back the next year to show the pictures I was doing with these cameras. This is Werda, who I showed you at the beginning when she was probably like 11 or 12, that by the last year that I was there, she had married and had her first child. So this is kind of an interesting way to, again, extend out a portfolio to have people at adolescence and entering adulthood in the same set of pictures. You can see in this one a couple of the guys looking at Polaroids that we had shot, and you can tell who the Americans are in this group because they're the ones that have their feet extended, which normally you wouldn't do, but they're extending their feet towards each other, so that wasn't as bad of an issue. And plus, the people that we worked with were fairly forgiving. They knew that we weren't trying to be insulting if we had our body positioned in the incorrect way, but that we just were not paying attention. The other communities that I tried to photograph too, which again I'm glad I did because of the way that over the last decade things have changed, is the Christian community that was established in this area of northeastern Syria too. And we ended up knowing quite a number of people in the neighboring towns and cities who were Christian, and worked with several of them every day at the excavation site and for other reasons too. And so I was able to photograph in their churches quite often in small towns and some of the bigger towns that were in the area, to try to kind of record the character of the ceremonies and the Christian traditions. Since we were excavating two churches, it was certainly important as field work to try to get out to talk to people so they could help us interpret what we were finding in the churches and the iconography, what that meant. And the archbishop of the area was, really helpful for us and friendly towards us to get us connected to the people that were helpful to help us interpret information and know more about the culture and the history of the culture. So Said Namata was, and still is, the archbishop of the whole Mesopotamian area of eastern Syria and western Iraq, and came to our site fairly regularly to see our excavation of the churches, and allowed me to photograph him pretty often, even during ceremonies too. I guess to some degree now, when I'm older, I might have more trepidation about getting up on the altar in some of these areas to make pictures, but I guess when I was younger, I was more fearless about getting in to do this kind of work, which you pretty much have to if you want to try to show something on a first-person level. And again, given how things have changed there, I'm glad that I was able to do this. This last picture is one that shows a dance where we got invited to weddings because we were pretty well known in the area, and so I was able to make pictures of not only religious ceremonies but also sometimes events that are associated with daily life, both Muslim weddings and Christian weddings too, which allowed for a lot of interesting pictures where I got to use flash and some other light sources occasionally for some variants, but again, the idea of getting connected at close range to people and conveying ideas is something that was important. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk with you about this work in field photography and archaeology, and so I'll be happy to visit you again at the regular meeting time when possible, but was also really happy that Jen asked me to give a bit of insight about the work that I do at this point too.